The empire died not with a roar but with the sigh of a collapsing lung. It was a sound Ilara had come to know intimately, having listened to the emperor's labored breaths for the final 6 months of his life. The rasp of fluid-filled passages, the stuttering beat of a failing heart. These were the sounds of the Valerian dynasty in its twilight. The conquering hordes of the scabrous clans were merely the fever that broke the patient. By the time their vanguard breached the capital's crimson gate, the throne was already a deathbed, the scepter a cold weight in a dead man's hand. To tend Ilara, third consort, the forgotten one, the quiet woman from the agrarian south, chosen for her placid nature and her family's unremarkable lineage, was an afterthought. While the first consort, a princess of the northern marches, poisoned herself with ceremonial dignity, and the second, a firebrand from the eastern coast, died with a dagger in her hand on the palace steps, Ilara simply walked away. She took her son Liam, the emperor's fifth and youngest child, a boy as quiet and overlooked as his mother. She packed 2 carpet-bags, one with dried fruit, hard cheese, and a whetstone, the other with Liam's spare tunic, a book of botany, and the small, smooth stones he liked to hold. Then she joined the river of refugees flowing north, her face smudged with dirt, her silk-cord dress already torn at the hem. She was just another woman fleeing the ruin. She walked for 3 weeks. The roads were choked with the desperate and the dying. She saw lords and ladies who had once sneered at her provincial accent, begging for a crust of bread. She saw merchants who had amassed fortunes, abandoning their gold for a swallow of clean water. The world had been turned upside down, and in the chaos, her particular brand of invisibility, once a source of quiet shame in the glittering court, became her greatest asset. No one looked twice at the thin woman with the watchful eyes and the silent boy clutching her hand. They saw a peasant, a servant, one of their own. She did not correct them. Her destination was a name whispered on the refugee road: Skyhold, a remote fortified monastery in the Dragon's Tooth Mountains, the designated fallback point for the last of the Imperial Legion. It was commanded by the one man the emperor had trusted implicitly, the one man the scabrous clans had never defeated in an open field. General Kalen. He was the empire's iron fist, its last standing stone. Ilara knew him only by reputation, a hard, unforgiving man who despised the court and its silken corruptions. She was walking into the arms of a man who would by all rights despise her. But Skyhold had walls. It had elevation. And according to the whispers, it had a well. For a woman with a 7-year-old son, that was everything. She arrived at dusk, her shoes worn through, the last of the cheese gone. Skyhold was less a monastery and more a raw wound of granite clawed from the mountainside. Its walls were stark and functional, its gate a maw of iron and heavy timber. The remnants of the 3rd and 5th Legions milled in the courtyard, their armor dented, their faces etched with the grim fatigue of a long retreat. They were not beaten, not yet, but they were running on a kind of stubborn momentum that Ilara recognized. It was the same energy that had kept her walking for 21 days. She saw him almost immediately. He stood on the parapet overlooking the gate, a broad-shouldered silhouette against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. Even from a distance, he radiated an aura of absolute, unyielding authority. As she and Liam were herded through the gate with a small group of other refugees, he descended the stone steps, his movements economical and severe. His face was a map of hard-won battles and sleepless nights. His eyes, the gray of creek stones after a hard rain, swept over the new arrivals with a cold, assessing gaze. They were not the eyes of a savior. They were the eyes of a man, counting liabilities. His gaze snagged on her. Perhaps it was the last vestige of courtly fabric in her tattered dress, or the way she held herself, not with arrogance, but with a straight-spined stillness that was out of place among the slumped shoulders of the other refugees. He walked toward her, his boots crunching on the gravel. "The palace leeches have found their way here, I see," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was not a question. Ilara met his gaze. She did not flinch or offer a title. Titles were ash, like the capital. "I am Ilara," This is my son, Liam. I know who you are, Kalen said, his lip curling with a faint contemptuous irony. The third consort, the little sparrow from Oakhaven. I suppose you've come seeking protection. I have come seeking walls, she corrected him quietly, and a place to stand. We have walls, he conceded, his eyes flicking from her to the boy, who hid his face in the folds of her skirt. But the space within them is for those who can earn it. We have soldiers to fight and mouths to feed. We have no room for ornaments. The insult was deliberate, a sharp, cruel jab meant to put her in her place. Alara's jaw tightened, but her voice remained level. I have never been an ornament, General, only a pot-bound plant. There is a difference. Before he could respond, a frantic-looking man in a quartermaster's tunic ran up to him, his face pale with panic. General! The grain stores! It's the damp! The last shipment from the lowlands. It's turning. Mold and weevils. Half of it is ruined. The salt meat is going rancid too. We don't have enough to last the month. A murmur of fear rippled through the nearby soldiers. Food was more than sustenance. It was morale. It was the promise of tomorrow. Kalen's face became a mask of stone, but Alara saw the flicker of desperation in his eyes. He was the pillar holding up the sky, but the ground beneath his feet was crumbling. And in that moment of crisis, Alara saw her chance. Not a plea, but a transaction. She dropped her 2 carpet bags on the dirt. She looked at the frantic quartermaster, at the grim-faced general, and at the weary soldiers who were now looking at her. She said the one thing a desperate woman was never supposed to say. I can fix it! Kalen turned his full attention back to her, his skepticism a palpable force. You? A consort? What do you know of grain stores? I know the smell of 5 different kinds of mold, Ilara said, her voice clear and precise, cutting through the courtyard's low hum of anxiety. I know the life cycle of a grain weevil. I know that your salt meat is rancid, not because of its age, but because it was cured with rock salt instead of sea salt, which lacks the necessary nitrates for long-term preservation. I know that I can salvage at least 2/3 of that grain, and I can teach your men how to smoke the remaining meat over juniper fires to make it last through the winter. My home province fed the capital for 300 years, General. We were farmers before we were courtiers. That is, knowledge the empire valued so little it forgot we had it, but I did not forget. Silence descended. The quartermaster stared at her, his mouth agape. The soldiers nearby had stopped their work to listen. They had expected tears, pleas. They had not expected a lecture on agricultural logistics. Kalen's eyes narrowed. He was a man who dealt in facts, in the brutal arithmetic of war. And she had just presented him with an equation he could not ignore. He looked at the chaos of his courtyard, at the faces of his hungry men, and then back at the slight, dirt-smudged woman who stood before him with the unyielding posture of an ancient oak. She was not asking for charity. She was making a wager, her life and her son's against her competence. Clear his throat. He was a cynic. He had seen the worst of humanity in the fall of the empire. He had seen bravery and cowardice, loyalty and betrayal. He trusted nothing and no one, least of all someone who had slept in the emperor's bed. But he was also a pragmatist, and the truth of his predicament was as sharp as a blade in his gut. His men were on the verge of starvation. You have 3 days, Kylan said, his voice flat. The kitchens, the granary, they are yours. The quartermaster will give you what you need. If you are right, you earn your place. If you are wrong. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. In a world this broken, failure was a death sentence. And my son? Ilara asked, her hand resting protectively on Liam's head. Kalen's gaze softened for the barest fraction of a second as he looked at the boy. He will be fed. We are not savages yet. He turned on his heel. 3 days, consort. Show me what you know. Ilara watched him walk away. Then she picked up her bags, took Liam's hand, and walked toward the heart of the fortress, her steps as steady and deliberate as if she were walking into a garden she had planted herself. The wager had been made. The kitchens of Skyhold were a study in organized despair. A handful of legionaries, conscripted into service as cooks, moved with the sullen inefficiency of men given a job they despised. The air was thick with the smell of scorched metal and stale water. A cauldron of thin, greasy soup bubbled over a low fire, promising little in the way of nourishment or comfort. It was a place for fueling bodies, not feeding souls. When Alara entered, a corporal with a flour-dusted frown looked up. "What do you want, madam? Rations are in an hour. General Kalen sent me," Alara said, setting her bags down on a flour-dusted table. "I'm to oversee the stores." The corporal snorted, a plume of flour rising from his mustache. "Oversee, lady? There's nothing to oversee but rot and ruin. We're counting lentils." "Then let's start there," she said. She did not raise her voice. She did not command. She simply untied the strings of her apron. An apron she had packed instead of a second court dress and tied it around her waist. The simple domestic act was so at odds with her perceived station that the men stopped their grumbling to watch. Her first stop was the granary. The quartermaster, a man named Corvin, led her there with the weary resignation of an undertaker. The stench hit them 10 feet from the door, a damp, musty odor, the signature scent of decay. Inside, sacks of wheat, barley, and rye were piled high. Alara ran her hand into the nearest sack of wheat. The grains were cool and faintly sticky. She brought a handful to her nose, her eyes closing as she inhaled. "It's ground damp," she said. "The floor stones are sweating. The sacks need to be raised on wooden pallets, and they're packed too tightly. There's no air circulation." She pointed to a dark patch on one of the sacks. "That's ashen mold. It spreads fast, but it's shallow. If we act now, we can save the grain underneath. The real problem is here." She moved to a different pile, her fingers digging deep. She pulled out a handful of grains, crawling with tiny black insects. "Weevils, they've nested in the barley. We'll lose this pile." Corvin looked defeated. "We'll starve." "No," Alara said firmly. "We won't." Her voice was a small, solid thing in the cavernous, dying room. "We will separate the good sacks from the compromised. We will build pallets from scrap wood. We will take the weevil-infested barley outside and burn it. The smoke will keep the insects from spreading. We will take the moldy wheat and spread it on tarps in the sun to kill the surface spores. What cannot be saved for bread can be fermented. We will have ale, and what cannot be saved for ale can be fed to the goats. Nothing is wasted." She was no longer a consort, she was a general in her own right, and this was her battlefield. Her words were orders, but they sounded like solutions. Hope, a commodity more precious than grain, began to flicker in Corvin's eyes. For the next 18 hours, Alara did not stop. She showed the men how to knock together pallets from old crates. She taught them to recognize the different kinds of mold, to sift the grain with wide mesh screens to separate the weevils. She worked alongside them, her hands dusty with flour and chaff, her face smudged, her movements economical and sure. Liam, her silent shadow, sat in a corner, sorting dried beans into piles with a focus that mirrored his mother's. He did not speak, but his presence was a quiet anchor. By nightfall, the immediate crisis in the granary was contained. The air already smelled cleaner, drier. Alara then turned her attention to the kitchens. She took the pot of greasy soup off the fire. She sent 2 men to the butcher, with precise instructions for the one scrawny pig that had been slaughtered that morning. She dispatched another to the small, neglected herb garden clinging to the monastery's inner wall. "Bring me thyme, rosemary, and any nettles you can find, and look for wild garlic by the east wall." The man stared at her. "Nettles? They sting. Boiled, they are as tender as spinach and rich in iron," she said without looking up from the onions she was chopping with a swift, rhythmic precision. "They will put blood back in your veins." That night, the men of Skyhold did not eat thin, greasy soup. They ate a thick, savory stew of pork, barley, and root vegetables, seasoned with herbs that tasted of the mountain itself. The flavor was rich and deep, and there was bread. Not the hard, tasteless tack they were used to, but dense, chewy loaves, made from salvaged rye flour, the crusts crackling. Alara had found a small, forgotten sourdough starter in a clay pot in the back of the pantry, dormant but alive. She had fed it, nurtured it, and brought it back to life, just like she was trying to do for all of them. The change in the Great Hall was immediate and profound. The usual sullen silence was replaced by murmurs of surprise, then of satisfaction. Men, who had been gulping their food down with grim necessity, now slowed, savoring each bite. It was more than a meal, it was a message. It said, "We are not finished. We are not just surviving. We can still live." General Kalen sat at the head table, a piece of the bread in his hand. He watched Alara as she moved through the hall, ladling stew into the bowls of his men, speaking quietly to her kitchen crew. She was not seeking praise. She was simply doing the work. He took a bite of the bread. It was real, substantial. He looked at the faces of his soldiers. He saw a flicker of something he had not seen in months: contentment. It was a dangerous feeling, but a necessary one. His gaze shifted to the internal balcony that overlooked the hall. A centurion named Cassian stood there, his arms crossed, his face a thundercloud. Cassian was a good soldier, fiercely loyal to the memory of the empire, which meant he was fiercely resentful of anything that reminded him of the court. He had been Kalen's second-in-command during the brutal retreat from the capital. He had seen nobles hoarding food while soldiers starved. To him, Alara was not a savior. She was a ghost from a feast he had never been invited to. Kalen could feel the man's resentment radiating from the balcony like a cold draft. It was a problem he would have to deal with later. For now, he focused on the woman in the apron. She had not just salvaged his grain, she had salvaged his men's morale with a bowl of stew and a loaf of bread. He had given her 3 days. She had remade his world in one. He had expected a pampered ornament. He was beginning to see the glint of forged steel. The next 2 days passed in a blur of methodical work. Alara established a rhythm in the fortress. Mornings were for processing, sifting grain, smoking meat, inventorying supplies. Afternoons were for preparation, kneading dough, chopping vegetables, tending the perpetual stew pot. Evenings were for planning. She sat with Corvin the quartermaster, a lantern between them, and created a ledger. She was not merely counting sacks, she was counting calories. She calculated the daily needs of a soldier on watch versus a man recovering in the infirmary. She cross-referenced their dwindling supplies with the edible resources of the mountain itself. Her book of botany, once a gentlewoman's hobby, became a vital strategic document. "The pine needles can be steeped into a tea rich in vitamin C," she explained to Corvin, pointing to a sketch in her book. "It will prevent the scurvy that plagued the Northern Legion 2 winters ago. The inner bark of the white birch can be ground into a flower extender. And these mushrooms," she pointed to another drawing, "are safe and plentiful, but only if harvested before the first frost." Corvin, a man who had spent 20 years counting spears and helmets, stared at her in awe. He was seeing the fortress and the mountain around it, not as a refuge, but as a larder. Allies began to emerge from the ranks. A young legionary named Reese, barely 18, was assigned to her full-time. Initially he was sullen, viewing kitchen duty as a punishment, but after watching her work, his resentment turned to respect. He saw the intelligence in her hands, the logic in her systems. He started asking questions, learning to identify herbs, to properly bank a fire. He also took a quiet liking to Liam, often carving small animals out of wood scraps for the boy, who would accept them with a solemn nod. An older, grizzled veteran named Boren, a man who had served in Kalen's personal guard for decades and was missing half an ear, became another silent supporter. He never spoke to Alara directly, but one afternoon, as she struggled to lift a heavy sack of flour, his scarred hand appeared, lifted the sack as if it were a feather, and placed it on the table for her. He gave a single, curt nod and walked away. In the stark social economy of Skyhold, it was a profound gesture of respect. It was noticed. But for every ally there was resistance. It was embodied by Cassian. He saw Alara's growing influence as a perversion of the natural order. Soldiers should follow commanders, not consorts. He saw the men's respect for her as a sign of weakness, a softening of the Legion's iron discipline. "She's a court butterfly," he snarled to his cadre of loyalists in the barracks. "She smiles and hands out bread, and suddenly everyone forgets she was part of the rot that killed us. She's hoarding the best food, I'd wager. keeping it for herself and her little princeling while the rest of us eat gruel. The accusation was baseless, but it was potent. Fear and scarcity were fertile ground for suspicion. The whispers started. The confrontation came on the third day, the day her probationary period was to end. Ilara was in the main storeroom supervising the stacking of the last of the salvaged grain when Cassian and two of his men strode in. "General's orders," Cassian said, his voice loud and accusatory. "We're here to conduct a surprise inspection, to make sure the rations are being distributed fairly." The kitchen workers, including Reese, stiffened. Ilara did not stop what she was doing. She was holding a wooden scoop, leveling the grain in a barrel. She finished the task with a calm, deliberate motion before turning to face him. "There's no need for a surprise, Centurion," she said, her voice even. "My ledgers are open to inspection at any time. They are on the table in the kitchen." "I don't trust ledgers written by a courtier's hand," Cassian sneered. "I trust what I can see. Open that small pantry." He pointed to a locked door at the back of the storeroom. "That is where I keep the yeast starter, the medicinal herbs, and the seeds we'll need for spring planting, should we survive that long," Ilara explained. "It is locked to maintain a stable temperature, or to hide the smoked hams and wine you've kept for yourself." Cassian shot back. "Open it." Ilara looked at him. She held the wooden grain scoop in her hand. It was a simple, utilitarian object, but in that tense moment, it seemed to carry a certain weight. She was not a warrior. She had no weapon, but she was not defenseless. "No," she said. Cassian's eyes widened in disbelief. "What did you say?" "I said no," Ilara repeated, her voice dropping slightly, gaining intensity. "You will not endanger our future for the sake of your baseless suspicions. The men under your command are fed, Centurion. They are fed better than they have been in a year. The infirmary has the tinctures it needs to fight fever. Our supplies, which were rotting 3 days ago, are now stable and accounted for. Every calorie is accounted for in that ledger. If you wish to challenge my authority, you may do so. But you will do it in front of the general. And you will explain to him why you are attempting to sabotage the only working supply system in this fortress." She took a step forward, the scoop held loosely at her side. "You see me, and you see the palace. You see silks and whispers. But I see you, Centurion Cassian, and I see a man so in love with the memory of a dead empire that he is willing to starve its children to prove a point. The empire is dead. It failed. Its politics, its luxuries, its pride, it all turned to ash. This," she swept a hand around the storeroom, at the sacks of grain and the hanging braids of garlic, "is what is real now. This is the only politics that matters." Cassian was momentarily speechless, his fury warring with his shock. His men shifted uncomfortably. They had come expecting to uncover a thief. They were instead being lectured on the New World Order by a woman holding a wooden spoon. "Who do you think you are?" he finally managed, taking a menacing step toward her. "She is the quartermaster of this fortress." The voice came from the doorway. It was Kalen. He stood there, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He had clearly been there for some time, listening. "Her authority in these matters is absolute," Kalen continued, his voice dangerously quiet. "It is my authority. And you, Centurion, are interfering with the lawful execution of her duties. You are sowing dissent. You are undermining morale. You are, in short, acting like a traitor." The word hung in the air, cold and heavy as iron. Cassian paled. "General, I know what you were doing," Kalen cut him off. "You were letting your bitterness poison this place." Ilara was given a task. She has succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. She has earned her place, and she has earned my trust. He walked past Cassian and stopped in front of Ilara. He looked at the ledger on the nearby table, then at her. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a public and unequivocal validation. "Your 3 days are over, Ilara. The position is permanent. See to it that my men are fed." He turned and looked at Cassian, his eyes like chips of ice. "Return to your duties, Centurion. And pray, I do not hear of you questioning my quartermaster again." Cassian stood frozen for a moment, his face a mask of humiliation. Then, with a stiff, formal bow, he turned and left, his men trailing behind him like chastened dogs. The storeroom was quiet. Rhys let out a breath. He did not realize he had been holding. Alara looked down at the wooden scoop in her hand and slowly, deliberately, placed it back in the barrel of grain. She had faced down the second most powerful man in Skyhold and won, not with force but with irrefutable competence. She had not just earned her place, she had claimed it. Kaelin's trust was not given lightly. It was a rare and heavy currency, and he had just spent some of it on her. In the weeks that followed, the dynamic within Skyhold shifted. Ilara was no longer the consort on probation. She was a recognized authority, a fixed point in their chaotic world. Her kitchens and storerooms became the heart of the fortress, a place of warmth, order, and the reassuring smells of baking bread and simmering stew. The men, even those once loyal to Cassian, began to call her the Provisioner, with a respect that bordered on reverence. Her work expanded beyond the immediate needs of the day. She began to think in seasons, not just meals. With Liam and Rhys as her assistants, she established a small protected nursery for the seeds she had guarded, coaxing tiny green shoots from the soil in wooden trays. It was an act of audacious hope, planting a spring garden in the heart of a winter siege. Kaelin began to seek her counsel on matters that had nothing to do with food. He would find her in the evenings, poring over her ledgers or her botany book by candlelight. He would unroll a map on the table and they would talk. "The scouts report the Scabbers clans are settling into the lowlands for the winter," he said one night, his finger tracing the line of a frozen river. "They'll be penned in by the snows until the thaw. But their foraging parties are becoming more aggressive. They're stripping the valleys bare." Ilara leaned over the map. Her hair, no longer styled in courtly fashion, was tied back in a simple braid. In the lantern light, her face had lost the soft, pampered look of the palace and taken on a new, more fundamental beauty, honed by work and purpose. "They live off the land," she mused, more to herself than to him. "That is their strength. But it is also their weakness. They have no supply lines. They are a locust swarm. Once the food is gone, they must move on or starve." Kaelin nodded. "My thoughts exactly. The question is, how long can we outlast them?" It was in this context, while studying the old monastery maps in an effort to find more storage space, that Ilara made her next discovery. Tucked away in a dusty archive, she found a set of schematics for the fortress that were far older and more detailed than the Legion's own. They showed not just the walls and buildings, but the mountain itself. They detailed a network of forgotten cisterns, old mining tunnels, and, most importantly, the original path of the spring that fed the main well. She spent 2 days tracing the lines on the schematics and comparing them to the physical structure of the monastery. She walked the perimeter, tapping on walls, pacing out distances. Finally, she went to Kaelin. "The aqueduct that feeds our well is inefficient," she announced, unrolling the old parchment on his command table. It was a later addition. The original builders drew their water from a higher point on the mountain and channeled it through a series of 3 lower cisterns. "See?" she pointed with a flour-dusted finger. "They're right beneath our feet. Sealed off probably 200 years ago when the western wing was rebuilt." Kaelin leaned in, his brow furrowed in concentration. "If we could unseal them, we would have a water supply 3 times our current capacity," Ilara finished for him. "Enough to withstand a summer-long siege. And it would be entirely internal. It could not be poisoned or diverted from the outside." But she wasn't done. While cross-referencing the monastery's records with old imperial shipping manifests she had found in the same archive, she had stumbled upon a second, more insidious problem. "There's something else," she said, her voice grim. She pulled out another set of documents. Grain shipment receipts from the province of Westmarch dating back 5 years. "Look at the weights. And the payment records." She pointed to a series of figures. "For 5 years, Duke Valerius of Westmarch has been supplying the Northern Army. According to these records, his shipments have been consistently 10% underweight. But the Treasury paid him the full price, more than the full price. The overpayments match." almost to the coin, the amount needed to fund a private legion of 5,000 men. Kalen straightened up, his face hardening. Valerius, he declared for the clans the moment the capital fell. He always claimed he was a loyalist, bled dry by the emperor's taxes. He was a thief, Alara said simply. He was bleeding the empire dry, not the other way around. He was building his own army on the emperor's coin for years. This is why your legions in the north were always underfed. It wasn't poor harvests. It was treason, paid for by the bushel. Kalen stared at the documents, then at her. The implications were staggering. It was a betrayal that reached back years. A slow, methodical hollowing out of the empire's strength from within. He had been fighting a war on two fronts without ever knowing it. And she had uncovered it all, not with spies or scouts, but with a grain ledger and a sharp mind. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, he saw past the provisioner, past the consort. He saw a strategist. He saw a mind that worked in patterns and systems that could trace the path of a single lie through years of doctored paperwork. The court had used her as a decorative vase, and all the while she had been quietly observing, learning, understanding the intricate machinery of the empire in a way few others ever had. "How did you see this?" he asked, his voice rough with a new kind of respect. "In the palace, no one ever spoke the truth aloud," Alara said. And her gaze distant. "You learned to listen for the lies. You learned to read the spaces between the words. A ledger is no different. It tells a story. You just have to know how to read the omissions." That night marked a profound shift. Halen acted on her information immediately. He put a team of his most trusted engineers to work, and within a week they had breached the wall to the old cisterns. A great gush of fresh, cold water filled the stone chambers, just as the schematics had promised. The fortress was now truly a fortress. The knowledge of Duke Valerius's treason was a colder comfort, but a weapon nonetheless. It was a secret. Kalen now held a card to be played when the time was right. His conversations with Alara grew more frequent, more personal. He found himself telling her of the disastrous final campaign, of the emperor's baffling orders, of the gnawing weariness that had settled deep in his bones. He spoke of his duty, the heavy, crushing weight of being the last man standing. She listened. She did not offer platitudes or easy comfort. She simply listened, her hands busy mending one of Liam's tunics or shelling peas, her presence a quiet, steadying force in the turbulent currents of his command. She in turn spoke of her home, Oakhaven, of the scent of the apple orchards after rain, of the quiet competence of her father, a man who could predict the weather by the ache in his joints and the behavior of the birds. She spoke of a life that was grounded, real, and a universe away from the gilded cage of the imperial court. In sharing these small pieces of their pasts, they began to build a bridge across the chasm that had once separated their worlds. He was the general, the iron fist. She was the provisioner, the nurturing hand. He was the shield of Skyhold. She was its heart. And they both knew, with a certainty that needed no words, that one was useless without the other. But the world outside the walls did not wait. As the mountain passes began to fill with snow, the real threat materialized. A scout, half frozen and bleeding from a wound in his side, stumbled into the fortress with the news they had been dreading. Vorlag, the most brutal and ambitious of the Scabrous clan chieftains, had not settled in for the winter. He had pushed his horde 10,000 strong up into the high passes. He had found them. The siege of Skyhold was about to begin. The early winter, which they had hoped would be their shield, was about to become their prison. The first sign of the horde was not a sound, but a sight, a dark stain spreading across the snow-covered valley floor below. Vorlag's army moved like a pestilence, a crawling mass of men and beasts of war. They made their camp just beyond the effective range of the Legion's catapults, a sprawling city of black tents and flickering bonfires. The siege had begun. The first weeks were a test of nerves. Vorlag was patient. He did not waste his men on futile assaults against the high walls of Skyhold. He simply surrounded them, cutting them off from the world. He was waiting for hunger and despair to do his work for him. It was the classic strategy of a besieging army. Inside the fortress, a tense calm prevailed. Largely thanks to Alara's foresight, the cisterns were full, the granaries were secure, rations were strict, but adequate. The men trusted Kalen to hold the walls, and they trusted Alara to keep their bowls full. This two-headed authority gave Skyhold a resilience it would otherwise have lacked. Kalen was a master of defensive warfare. He organized patrols, rationed the use of arrows and catapult stones, and maintained a constant vigilant watch. But as the days turned into weeks, the strain began to show. The cold was relentless. A wasting sickness, a cousin to pneumonia, began to creep through the barracks. The infirmary filled. The crisis came a month into the siege. A daring raid by Vorlag's men, under the cover of a sudden blizzard, managed to set fire to one of the outer watchtowers. Kalen himself led the party to repel the attackers and fight the flames. In the chaos of the fight, on a slick, ice-covered parapet, he took a glancing blow to the head and a deep gash in his leg. He was carried back to his chambers, conscious but disoriented, a raging fever already taking hold. The pillar had cracked, with Kalen incapacitated. The command structure faltered. Cassian, his old resentment simmering just below the surface, saw his chance to reclaim authority. He argued for a direct assault, a glorious, desperate charge to break the siege. "We cannot sit here and wait to die of plague," he bellowed in the hastily assembled war council. "We are lions of the empire, not sheep in a pen. We must meet them on the field, while we still have the strength to fight." It was a speech born of pride and fear, appealing to the legionaries' warrior instincts. Many of the younger officers, tired of waiting, roared their approval. Old Boren, the veteran, stood silent, his face grim. He knew a suicide mission when he heard one, but he was just one voice. The tide was turning toward Cassian's madness. The council was held in the Great Hall, the same room where Alara had first served her miraculous stew. She was not invited. She was, after all, just the provisioner. But Reese, her young ally, came to her in the kitchens, his face pale with alarm. "They're going to do it," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They're going to follow Cassian. They'll all be slaughtered." Alara was kneading dough for the next day's bread. Her hands did not stop their rhythmic, steady work. Push, fold, turn. Push, fold, turn. It was a calming motion, a small point of order in a world descending into chaos. She listened as Reese recounted Cassian's fiery speech. When he was finished, she looked up, her hands white with flour. "Where's the general?" "In his chambers." "The maester says the fever is high. He's not lucid." Alara wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at the dough, a living, breathing thing on the board. She looked at Liam, who was sitting by the fire, carefully polishing his collection of smooth river stones. She looked at the fear in Reese's eyes. "Then I will go," she said. "Go where?" Reese asked, confused. "To the council? They won't listen to you." "I am not going to ask for their permission," Alara said. She took off her apron and folded it neatly on the table. "I am going to take command." She strode into the great hall like a winter storm. The officers, deep in their heated debate, fell silent at her entrance. She was a woman, a consort, and she had just walked into their sacred space, the domain of men and war. Cassian was the first to find his voice. "What is the meaning of this? This is a war council. You have no place here." Alara walked to the great map table in the center of the room, the same table where she and Kalen had spent so many hours. She placed both her hands flat on its surface. "You are right, Centurion," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that silenced any further protest. "I am not a soldier. I do not know how to lead a charge or swing a sword. But I know our enemy and your plan." She looked directly at Cassian, her eyes blazing. "We'll not break this siege." "And to Sig, Sa. It will hand Vorlag our heads on a platter." "And what is your brilliant plan, consort?" Cassian sneered. "To bake them a cake so delicious they simply go home." A few of his supporters chuckled, but the laughter died in their throats. Ilara's expression did not change. "My plan," she said, "is to fight a war. Vorlag does not understand. He expects you to be soldiers. He expects a glorious charge. He understands iron and fire. He does not understand patience. He does not understand logistics. And he does not understand the mountain." She leaned over the map. "Vorlag's army is 10,000 strong. That means 10,000 mouths to feed every single day in the dead of winter. His foraging parties are his lifeline. We will not attack his army. We will attack his stomach." She began to speak, her voice low and rapid, her finger moving across the map, tracing paths, marking locations. Her plan was a masterpiece of unconventional warfare, born from a farmer's knowledge and a courtier's cunning. "We will use the old mining tunnels, the ones on the eastern schematics, to send out small elite raiding parties. No more than 5 men each. Their targets are not soldiers. Their targets are food caches, hunting parties, supply mules. They will strike at night and melt back into the snow. We will make every tree, every shadow an enemy to them." She looked up, her gaze sweeping across the astonished faces of the officers. "Furthermore, we will use the mountain's own defenses. Hey, the spring that feeds the lower valley where his main camp is can be diverted. But we will do more than that. I have identified a patch of blackroot 2 miles upstream. It is not lethal, but a small amount, introduced into the water supply, will cause severe stomach cramps and nausea for days. His army will be weakened, demoralized, and sick." It was diabolical. It was brilliant. It was a woman's warfare, not of clashing steel, but of tainted water and empty bellies. "And finally," she said, playing her last, most valuable card, "we will use the truth." She looked at Boran, the old veteran. "I need your best messenger, a man who can cross the northern pass in a blizzard." She then turned back to the map, pointing to a territory north of Duke Valerius's lands. "This is the territory of the Grey Falcon clan. They swore allegiance to Vorlag out of fear, but they hate Duke Valerius more. We will send them a message. We will offer them a deal." "A deal?" Cassian sputtered. "With traitors?" "A pragmatic deal," Lara corrected him. "We will send them proof of Valerius's treason against the Empire, the grain ledgers. We will tell them that when the snows clear, the last of the Imperial Legion will march on Valerius's lands to claim them for the traitors they are. But if the Grey Falcon clan were to create a diversion, a raid on the rear of Vorlag's camp in 2 weeks' time, then the new lords of Skyhold might be inclined to recognize their claim to Valerius's fertile northern plains. We will even offer to trade our surplus grain for their timber in the spring." She straightened up. The hall was utterly silent. The officers were staring at her, their expressions a mixture of awe and disbelief. She had just laid out a multi-pronged strategy that combined guerrilla warfare, biological sabotage, and political manipulation. She had taken all the pieces on the board, the tunnels, the herbs, the treasonous ledgers, the clan rivalries, and woven them into a single cohesive plan for victory. Cassian looked as if he had been struck by lightning. His plan of a glorious charge seemed like a child's tantrum in comparison. It was Boran who broke the silence. The old scarred veteran stepped forward. He looked at Alara, then at the assembled officers. "General Kalen is incapacitated," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Until he recovers, command falls to the one with the best plan. And this is the only plan that is not suicide." He turned and faced Ilara directly. He did not bow, but his nod was deep and respectful. "Tell us our orders, Provisioner." One by one, the other officers nodded their assent. Even Cassian, his face pale, gave a stiff, reluctant nod. He had been outmaneuvered, outthought, and utterly defeated. Not by a general, but by the forgotten consort. In that moment, Ilara held the fate of Skyhold in her hands. She did not ask for the power, but when it was offered, she did not refuse it. She had spent a lifetime being overlooked. Now, everyone was watching, and she would not fail. The next 2 weeks were the most critical in Skyhold's short history. Alara's plan was put into motion with a quiet, deadly efficiency. The fortress, which had been a passive shield, became an active weapon. Small teams of legionaries, hand-picked by Boran for their stealth and resilience, slipped out through the mining tunnels under the cover of the swirling snows. They were specters in the white landscape. They did not engage the main army. They bled it. A store of smoked meat found and burned. A team of hunters ambushed and their game taken. Mules carrying precious firewood scattered into the blizzard. Each raid was small, almost insignificant on its own. But cumulatively, they were a death by 1,000 cuts. From the walls of Skyhold, they could see the growing frustration in Vorlag's camp. More guards on patrol, larger, foraging parties, a palpable sense of paranoia. Meanwhile, Ilara herself oversaw the second part of her plan. With Rhys's help, she harvested the black root from a windswept cliff face. It was a dangerous task, the roots clinging to the rock just above a sheer drop. But she worked with the same calm focus she applied to kneading dough. That night, a single legionary crept down to the stream that fed the valley and emptied a sack of the chopped, bruised root into the current. The effects were visible within 2 days. The sentries on the walls reported a marked decrease in activity from the enemy camp. The smoke from their cookfires seemed less frequent. Through his spyglass, Boran could see men clutching their stomachs, a wave of sickness spreading through the ranks. Vorlag's army, which had prided itself on its ruggedness, was being brought low by an enemy it could not see or fight. The final piece of the plan was the messenger. A wiry scout named Jorik, the man Boran had chosen, was sent north with the damning evidence of Duke Valerius's treason tucked into his boot. It was a perilous journey, a gamble on the greed and ambition of a rival clan. For 10 agonizing days there was no word. Every morning, Ilara would climb the highest tower and stare at the northern pass, a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. During this time, General Kalen slowly recovered, his fever broke, and his mind clear. Boran and the Maester kept him informed of the situation, of Ilara's bold seizure of command, of the unconventional war she was waging. Kalen listened, his expression unreadable. He did not countermand her orders. He did not reassert his own command. He simply watched and waited. He saw his men, though still besieged, moving with a renewed sense of purpose. He heard the reports from the raiding parties. He saw the sickness spreading through Vorlag's camp. He was watching a master at work. From his window, he could see Ilara in the courtyard, directing the distribution of the daily rations. Her son, Liam, always nearby. She still looked like a simple provisioner. But Kalen now saw the truth. The fortress had 2 commanders, one of the sword and one of the soil, and it was the commander of the soil who was winning the war. The turning point came on the 14th day, exactly as Ilara had hoped. As the pale dawn broke over the snow-covered peaks, a new banner was spotted to the north. It was not the banner of the Empire, nor of Vorlag's horde. It was a gray falcon on a field of white. A force of 500 horsemen, the elite warriors of the Grey Falcon clan, descended from the pass and slammed into the rear of Vorlag's unsuspecting camp. They were not there to win a battle. They were there to create chaos. They set fire to tents, scattered the pack animals, and engaged the rear guard in a furious, bloody skirmish before melting back into the mountains. For Vorlag, it was the final straw. His army was starving, sick, and now beset from the rear. The mountain itself seemed to have turned against him. His position was no longer tenable. He was a great warrior, but he was not a fool. He had come to conquer a fortress, but he found himself fighting a ghost. The decision was swift. Within hours, the great horde began to break camp. The black tents were struck, the war beasts rounded up. It was not an orderly withdrawal. It was a retreat. By nightfall, the valley below Skyhold was empty, littered with the debris of a defeated army. A profound, almost shocking silence descended upon the mountain. The siege was broken. There was no great cheer from the walls of Skyhold. The legionaries were too weary, too stunned by the suddenness of their victory. They simply stood on the parapets, watching the last of their enemies disappear into the swirling snow, their breath misting in the frigid air. Ilara stood on the main balcony, Liam's small hand tucked firmly in hers. She looked out over the empty valley, her face impassive. She felt no elation, only a deep, quiet sense of finality. She had waged a war and won. She had done what she had to do to protect her son, to protect this last bastion of a broken world. A heavy cloak was draped over her shoulders. She turned. It was Kalen. He had left his chambers for the first time since his injury. He looked pale and leaner, but his eyes were clear. He stood beside her, his gaze also fixed on the valley. "They're gone," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she replied. They stood in silence for a long time, the only sound the whip of the wind around the stone battlements. "Cassian's charge would have failed," Kalen said at last, his voice low. "He would have thrown away our last legion on the pyre of his own pride. You knew that." "I knew we could not win his way," Alara said. "So I chose to fight my way." Kalen turned to face her. The hard, cynical mask he usually wore was gone. In its place was something more complex. Respect, gratitude, and a kind of awe. The court saw you as a quiet decoration. The emperor saw you as a gentle comfort. My men saw you as a cook. Even I, he admitted, his voice rough with self-reproach, saw you as a liability. We were all blind. He looked at her, at the woman who had saved them all with her knowledge of herbs and grain and the dark, tangled politics of the human heart. "The empire is gone, Alara. Its armies, its laws, its titles, they are all dust. We are all that's left, and we would be dust too, if not for you." He had called her Alara, not consort, not provisioner. Her name. "What we have here," he gestured to the fortress around them, "is not a legion. It's not an outpost of a dead empire. It's a beginning, a chance to build something new. Something that might last." He unrolled a map on the cold stone of the balcony railing. It was a detailed map of the valley below and the surrounding lands. "This is ours now. By right of survival, we can make a life here, a home. But it needs more than a commander. It needs more than walls and swords. It needs a founder." He looked from the map to her face. His next words were not a proposal, in the old sense, not a matter of politics or dynasty. They were simpler and far more profound. "I can hold the walls, but you know how to make things grow. You know how to build a future from the ground up. Stay, Alara, not as a refugee, not as a provisioner, as my partner. Let us build this home together." It was a permanent offer, a redefinition of everything. He was not offering her protection. He was offering her a partnership, a shared crown to a kingdom that did not yet exist. Alara looked down at Liam, who was watching them, with his wide, silent eyes. She looked at the valley, empty and white and full of promise. She had come to Skyhold seeking only survival. She had been a pot-bound plant, and the fall of the empire had shattered the pot, forcing her to put down roots in the hard, stony ground of reality. And she had not just survived, she had thrived. She looked at Kalen, at the weary, honorable man who was offering her half of his world. She had a choice. She could leave, take Liam, and find some quiet corner of the world to disappear into. Or she could stay. She could build. She gave a small, slow nod. "We will need to test the soil in the lower fields before the thaw," she said, her voice practical, "but with a current of warmth running through it. The south-facing slopes will be best for the barley." Slow smiles spread across Kalen's face, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him. It transformed his harsh features, making him look younger, less burdened. It was the smile of a man who had just found hope in the most unexpected of places. The final scene is not one of war or politics. It is one of quiet domesticity. Several months later, the snows have receded and the valley is awash in the pale tentative green of early spring. The air smells of damp earth and new life. The black tents of Forlag's army are a distant memory, replaced by neat rows of tilled soil. Alara is on her knees in one of the newly plowed fields. Her dress is simple, practical wool. Her hands are deep in the rich, dark earth. Beside her, Liam is carefully placing seeds into the furrow she has made. He is no longer just a silent witness. He is a participant. He looks up at his mother, and for the first time, a small, clear voice is heard. "Like this?" he asks, holding up a seed. Alara smiles, a genuine, unburdened smile. "Yes, my love." Exactly like that, high above on the walls of Skyhold, General Kalen stands watching. He is not looking for enemies on the horizon. His gaze is fixed on the woman and the boy in the field below. He is no longer just a commander guarding a fortress. He is a man watching his future being planted. The men of the Legion are no longer just soldiers. They are farmers and builders, turning their swords into plowshares. Cassian, humbled and changed, directs a team clearing stones from a nearby field. The fortress is no longer a refuge from a dying world. It is the heart of a new one. The old Valerian Empire, in its arrogance and vanity, had demanded a beautiful, silent consort to adorn its palace. It had wanted an ornament, a symbol of its wealth and power. In its final, desperate moments, gasping for breath as the world burned down around it, what the empire truly needed was not another jewel for its crown, but a farmer who knew the value of a single grain of wheat. It never got what it needed, but in the ruins it left behind, the survivors did. What they got was the woman who made it a home.